The question arrived in a Tuesday morning email buried between a printer jam on the sixth floor and a password reset for someone who'd locked themselves out for the third time that week. Subject line urgent. Executive floor system malfunction. Jerome Washington stared at the screen, his coffee going cold in the styrofoam cup beside his keyboard. 3 years at Sterling Enterprises, and he'd never received a ticket from the 40th floor. The email came from Patricia Collins' executive administration with instructions so precise they felt like coordinates to a military operation. 10 o'clock, Victoria Sterling's office. System crash during video conference. Time-sensitive materials inaccessible. Jerome glanced at the clock. 9:47. He had 13 minutes to finish the spreadsheet recovery he'd been nursing for the past hour, grab his toolkit, and ride an elevator into territory he'd spent 3 years successfully avoiding. The third floor hummed around him with its familiar rhythm, keyboards clicking in their steady percussion, someone laughing 2 cubicles over, the air conditioning cycling on with its slight mechanical wheeze that maintenance kept promising to fix. This was his ecosystem, predictable, safe, invisible in the best possible way. The spreadsheet finally cooperated at 9:53. Jerome saved it 3 times, sent the confirmation email, then pulled his toolkit from under the desk. The weight of it felt heavier than usual, though nothing inside had changed. Same cables, same diagnostic tools, same thermal paste that he'd only used twice in 3 years, but carried anyway because you never knew. He stood up, stretched his back, and caught his reflection in the darkened monitor across from his desk. 34 years old, clean-shaven because Zoe said his stubble tickled when he kissed her goodnight. Button-down shirt from Target Blue because it didn't show coffee stains. Completely unremarkable, which was exactly how he preferred it. The elevator bank sat at the building's core, accessible from each floor through glass doors that reflected everyone who passed through them. Jerome pushed through and pressed the up button. His reflection multiplied across 3 elevator doors. A black man in a sea of reflective surfaces holding a toolkit that had seen better days. He looked away. The elevator arrived with a soft chime, empty except for the faint smell of someone's expensive cologne lingering in the recycled air. Jerome stepped inside and pressed 40. The doors closed, sealing him into the ascending box. Numbers climbed on the digital display above the door. 5, 8, 12. Jerome had only been above the 20th floor a handful of times, usually for conference room equipment installations that required 2 people and a ladder. Those trips had been planned days in advance, scheduled around meetings executed with the kind of precision that kept IT techs invisible and unnoticed. This felt different, unplanned, urgent, personal in a way that made his shoulders tense. 23, 27, 31. The elevator didn't stop. No one else got on. Just Jerome and his toolkit rising through the building's strata toward whatever waited on the 40th floor. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out. Text from Zoe sent from her classroom where she was supposed to be doing math worksheets. "Can Brianna come over after school?" "Her mom said yes if you say yes," Jerome typed back quickly. "School day. Ask me again after homework is done." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. "Fine, but you never say yes." The dots vanished. Jerome pocketed his phone and watched the numbers climb. 36, 37, 38. The morning had started like every other morning in the 3 years since Jerome's life had contracted into its current shape. Alarm at 6:15. Shower while Zoe slept, her small body curled under covers, decorated with planets and constellations. Breakfast at 6:45. Scrambled eggs because they were fast and Zoe would actually eat them without negotiation. She'd sat at their small kitchen table, still half asleep, pushing eggs around her plate while Jerome packed her lunch. Turkey sandwich, apple slices, granola bar, juice box. The same lunch he packed 4 days out of 5, with pizza Fridays as the exception that made the routine bearable. They'd left the apartment at 7:20, walked 3 blocks to Oakwood Elementary, joined the stream of parents and kids funneling toward the main entrance. Jerome had watched Zoe disappear into the building, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, her braids swinging with each step. She hadn't looked back. 8 years old and already practicing independence, preparing for the day when she wouldn't need him to walk her to school anymore. The thought arrived with its usual dual edge of pride and preemptive grief. 39. The elevator slowed. 40. The doors opened onto a reception area that Jerome's monthly salary couldn't have decorated. Marble floors caught the morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows. Abstract paintings hung on walls the color of heavy cream. A reception desk curved along the far wall, dark wood polished to a mirror finish. The woman behind it looked up. 50s, perfect posture, a smile that had been calibrated for professional warmth without actual friendliness. Her eyes swept over Jerome with the practiced assessment of someone whose job included filtering who belonged on this floor and who didn't. Jerome held up his badge before she could ask. The photo on it was from his first week at Sterling Enterprises. Younger face, more optimism in his eyes. The security department kept threatening to update everyone's photos, but funding never materialized. Jerome didn't mind. That younger version of himself felt like someone else anyway. Someone who'd still believed that working hard and keeping his head down would eventually lead somewhere other than a third-floor desk surrounded by printer jams and password resets. The receptionist glanced at the badge, then at her computer screen, confirming what she already knew. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with the efficiency of someone who'd typed the same information 1,000 times. She looked back up at Jerome, her smile unchanged. "Miss Sterling is expecting you. Third door on the left." She gestured down a hallway that stretched toward the windows lined with doors that probably led to offices bigger than Jerome's entire apartment. "She has meetings starting at 11. The system needs to be operational before then." Jerome nodded and started walking. His shoes made soft sounds against the marble, each step announcing his presence in a space designed for people who belonged here. The hallway felt longer than it had looked from the reception area. Doors passed on his left, each one closed. Through the windows on his right, the city spread out below in its Tuesday morning configuration. Cars threading through streets, buildings catching sunlight, people living their lives in the space between concrete and glass, none of them aware that Jerome Washington was walking down a 40th floor hallway toward an office he'd never imagined entering. The third door stood partially open. Jerome stopped outside it, close enough to hear a voice inside, but not close enough to see who was speaking. The voice was female-controlled with an edge underneath that suggested patience wearing thin. Victoria Sterling. He'd seen her exactly 7 times in 3 years. Once in the lobby during his first week surrounded by executives in suits that cost more than his monthly rent. Twice in company-wide video meetings, her face filling screens across the building while she discussed quarterly results and strategic initiatives. 4 times passing through the third floor, with her entourage moving too quickly for Jerome to do more than glance up from whatever computer he was fixing. He'd never heard her voice directed at him, never stood close enough to see the details that the company headshots smoothed away. Now he was about to walk into her office, touch her computer, exist in her space for however long it took to fix whatever had gone wrong. The thought made his palms sweat against the handle of his toolkit. He adjusted his grip and knocked twice on the doorframe, a sound that felt too loud and too quiet at the same time. "Come in." Jerome pushed the door open. The office was enormous, bigger than the third-floor break room, bigger than the conference room where they held the quarterly all-hands meetings. Windows dominated the far wall, offering a view that probably cost extra in the rent calculations for this much real estate. Victoria Sterling stood with her back to the door phone pressed to her ear, her free hand gesturing slightly as she spoke. Tall, taller than Jerome had expected from the video meetings where everyone sat down and height became irrelevant. Her dark hair was pulled back in a style that looked effortless, but probably required professional intervention. She wore a suit the color of charcoal, perfectly tailored, the kind of garment that announced its price without needing a visible label. "I don't care what the Tokyo projections say." Her voice carried the same controlled edge Jerome had heard from the hallway. "If they can't deliver the numbers they promised by the end of the quarter, we restructure the entire division. I'm not interested in excuses, I'm interested in results." A pause while whoever was on the other end said something. Victoria turned slightly enough for Jerome to see her profile. Sharp jawline, expression that could have been carved from stone. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped lower, more dangerous. "Then I suggest you make them understand that failure to meet their commitments has consequences. We'll discuss this further after my 11 o'clock. She ended the call and turned around. For exactly 3 seconds, her eyes focused on Jerome with an intensity that felt like being scanned by some kind of biological assessment tool. She was evaluating him, categorizing him, deciding whether he met whatever standard she applied to people who entered her office. Jerome wondered if she saw the coffee stain he'd missed on his collar, the scuff on his left shoe, the fact that his toolkit was held together with duct tape in two places. He wondered if she noticed that he was black, if it registered as relevant or irrelevant in whatever calculation was happening behind those eyes. Then something shifted in her expression. The intensity didn't disappear, but it recalibrated slightly, became fractionally less sharp, more human. "You're from the question wasn't really a question, more like a confirmation of something she already knew. Jerome nodded anyway, then realized she probably had expected words. "Yes, ma'am, Jerome Washington. I received the call about a system malfunction. It crashed during a video conference 20 minutes ago." Victoria gestured toward her desk, a massive piece of furniture that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of wood. Three monitors sat dark and lifeless on its surface, surrounded by neat stacks of documents and a laptop that was probably worth more than Jerome's car. "Won't restart properly. I have presentations to review before the investor meetings this afternoon. I need access to those files within the next 40 minutes. Jerome moved toward the desk, acutely aware of Victoria's presence behind him. He set his toolkit down carefully on the corner, trying not to disturb the precisely arranged documents. Each stack had been organized with intention. Project names visible on folder tabs, dates written in neat handwriting. This was someone who controlled chaos through organization, who imposed order on complexity because disorder was unacceptable. He pulled his diagnostic tablet from the toolkit and powered it on while the monitors stayed dark. Victoria didn't leave. She stepped back, giving him physical space but maintaining her presence. She stood near the windows, arms crossed, watching him work. Jerome had expected her to return to her phone to fire off emails or make another call to someone in Tokyo or wherever else her empire extended. Instead, she just watched, silent, observant. The weight of her attention pressed against his shoulders like a physical thing. Jerome tried to focus on the system. He checked connections first. Display cables were secure. Power cables were properly seated. Nothing obviously disconnected or damaged. He pressed the power button on the main computer. Nothing happened. He held it down for 10 seconds, forcing a hard shutdown, then tried again. A faint whir indicated the machine was attempting to boot, but the monitors remained dark. The sound continued for several seconds, then stopped. Failed boot sequence. Something was corrupted in the startup process. He pulled up the diagnostic interface on his tablet and connected it to the tower via USB. The screen filled with code scrolling information about attempted system loads and failures. A corrupted registry file. That was fixable, but it would take time. Time to boot into safe mode, time to locate the corrupted file, time to restore from backup or rebuild manually. Time that Victoria Sterling apparently didn't have before her 11 o'clock investor meeting. Jerome glanced at the clock on the wall. 10:17. He had 43 minutes to make this work. "What's the diagnosis?" Victoria's voice came from the window, startling him slightly. He'd almost forgotten she was there. Or maybe he'd just gotten used to working while people hovered nearby, their presence fading into background noise. He turned to face her. She hadn't moved, still standing with her arms crossed, still watching him with that same focused intensity. Corrupted registry file. Jerome kept his voice steady, professional. The system tried to boot but couldn't complete the sequence. "I can fix it, but it'll take some time. I need to boot into recovery mode and restore from backup." "How much time?" 30 minutes, maybe 40 if there are complications. Victoria's jaw tightened slightly. That was the only indication that the timeline didn't work for her. She uncrossed her arms and walked to the windows looking out over the city. From this angle, Jerome could see her reflection in the glass. She was younger than he'd thought. Mid-40s maybe. The professional photographs made her look older, or maybe they just made her look more severe, less human. Out here in the actual light, standing against the windows, she looked like someone who'd given up sleep to build an empire and was now paying the price in the fine lines around her eyes. "Do what you need to do," her reflection spoke to him in the glass. "Just make it work." Jerome turned back to the computer and got to work. He initiated the recovery boot sequence, watching code scroll across his tablet screen. The system responded sluggish but functional. He navigated through menus, located the backup files, identified the corrupted registry entries. His fingers moved across the tablet with the muscle memory of someone who'd performed this exact procedure hundreds of times. Different computers, different offices, same fundamental problem. Corruption was corruption whether it happened on the third floor or the 40th. Behind him, Victoria's phone buzzed. She answered it without moving from the windows. Yes. A pause. Tell them I'll call back after 11. No, it can't wait until then, which is why I'll call them back when I'm available. Another pause. I don't care if he's unhappy about it. He can remain unhappy for the next hour and a half. She ended the call. The phone went silent. The recovery process continued. Jerome watched the progress bar inch across his tablet screen. 15%, 20%. He'd learned early in his IT career that progress bars were mostly lies. They moved at their own pace, governed by algorithms that bore no relationship to human patience or investor meeting schedules. All he could do was wait and hope that nothing else corrupted during the recovery process. He glanced at the clock, 10:29, 31 minutes until 11. The progress bar showed 38% complete. Victoria's phone buzzed again. She looked at it, frowned, and didn't answer. It buzzed twice more, then went silent. Jerome kept his eyes on his tablet screen. 42%, 45%. The system was responding well, no new errors appearing in the diagnostic log. That was good. That meant the corruption was isolated, containable, fixable within the timeline he'd promised. Do you have children, Mr. Washington? The question came from nowhere, or at least from no conversational thread that Jerome could identify. He looked up. Victoria had turned away from the windows and was looking directly at him. Not at the computer, at him. He hesitated and unsure whether this was small talk or some kind of test. His instinct was to keep answers short, professional, reveal nothing that could be used against him later. But something in her expression suggested the question was genuine, not tactical. Yes, ma'am, a daughter, 8 years old. What's her name, Zoe? That's a beautiful name. Victoria's expression softened slightly. Something in her eyes changed, became less CEO and more human. Is she your only child? Yes, ma'am. Are you married? The question hit harder than it should have. Jerome looked back at his tablet screen, watching the progress bar crawl toward 50%. Divorced 3 years ago. I'm sorry. That must be difficult. Jerome didn't respond. What was there to say? Yes, it was difficult. Yes, it had shattered the future he'd imagined when he was 25 and stupid enough to believe that love and effort were sufficient for building a life. Yes, he spent every day balancing Zoe's needs against financial reality while his ex-wife built a new life in Portland with someone who made more money and had more potential and never had to fix computers for a living. But none of that was appropriate to say to a billionaire CEO while fixing her computer. So he said nothing and watched the progress bar reach 53%. Victoria didn't push. She turned back to the windows, giving him space. The silence stretched out, filled only by the soft whir of the computer, working through its recovery sequence. Jerome checked the clock. 10:37, 23 minutes until 11. Progress bar at 59%. They might actually make the deadline. I was married once. Victoria spoke to the windows, to the city beyond them, maybe to herself. Her voice had changed, less controlled, more reflective. 22 years old, fresh out of business school. He was a banker, very successful, very confident, very certain that I would give up my ridiculous startup idea and do something practical. Jerome's hands stilled on his tablet. This wasn't small talk. This was something else. Something more personal than he'd expected from someone who lived 40 floors above the regular employees. He didn't know what to do with it, whether to respond or stay silent, whether this was a moment of genuine connection or just Victoria Sterling thinking out loud while waiting for her computer to fix itself. What happened? The question slipped out before Jerome could stop it. Immediately he regretted it. Too personal, too presumptuous. But Victoria didn't seem offended. I built the company anyway. Her reflection smiled in the glass, but there was no warmth in it. He divorced me 3 years later, said I'd chosen my work over our marriage. He wasn't wrong. She turned from the window to face Jerome directly. Success requires sacrifice. I just didn't realize how much I was sacrificing until it was already gone. The progress bar hit 71%. Jerome watched it climb while processing what Victoria had just told him. The timeline matched. Her company was 20 years old, founded by Victoria Sterling when she was 24, according to the brief history printed in every quarterly report. That meant the divorce had happened 17 years ago. 17 years of success and sacrifice. 17 years of building an empire while losing everything else. Do you ever regret it? Jerome asked. The question was too direct, too personal, crossing every professional boundary that existed between an IT technician and a CEO. But they'd already crossed so many boundaries in this conversation that one more didn't seem to matter. Victoria considered the question for a long moment. Her eyes moved from Jerome to the windows, to the city spread out below, to some internal landscape he couldn't see. Every day. Her voice was soft, almost too quiet to hear. And never. Both things are true at the same time. The progress bar reached 85%. 10:41, 19 minutes until 11. The recovery was going to finish ahead of schedule. Jerome should have felt relieved. Instead, he felt something more complicated. Like he'd stumbled into a conversation that mattered more than computer repairs. Like Victoria Sterling had just handed him something fragile, and he didn't know how to hold it without breaking. The system completed its recovery at 89%, then jumped to 100% all at once. Progress bars really were lies. The monitors flickered to life, simultaneously filling with light. The Sterling Enterprises logo appeared, followed by the boot sequence. Jerome watched the startup process, waiting for error messages or warning signs. None appeared. The system loaded smoothly, transitioning from boot screen to login screen without any indication of the corruption that had crashed it 40 minutes earlier. Everything's restored. Jerome kept his voice professional, pushing down the strange intimacy that had developed during the conversation. You should be able to access all your files once you log in. Victoria moved from the windows to the desk. She stood beside Jerome, close enough that he could smell her perfume. Something expensive, something that probably cost more than his monthly groceries. She leaned over and typed her password, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. The system accepted the credentials and loaded her desktop. Clean, organized, folders labeled with project names and dates, professional wallpaper showing the Sterling Enterprises logo against a neutral background. Except that's not what loaded. The system hesitated for exactly 2 seconds, and in that hesitation, something went wrong with the display sequence. Instead of stopping at the login screen, the system loaded past it, loaded the underlying desktop, loaded the background image that Victoria had set as her wallpaper before replacing it with the corporate logo, loaded it in full resolution across the center monitor. Jerome's hand froze over the keyboard. He'd been reaching to close the errant window to get the system back to its proper login screen. But his hand stopped halfway, suspended in the air, while his brain processed what he was seeing. The image filled the entire monitor. A photograph of Victoria Sterling standing on a wooden dock beside a lake. Mountains rose behind her in the distance. Water stretched out flat and blue. The light was golden late afternoon sun catching her face. She wore jeans, a simple white shirt, no jewelry, no makeup that Jerome could identify. Her hair hung loose around her shoulders, moving slightly in whatever breeze had been blowing when the photo was taken. And she was smiling, not the controlled expression from company headshots, not the professional mask she wore in meetings, a genuine smile, unguarded, real. The Victoria in the photograph looked peaceful, happy, like someone who'd found exactly where she was supposed to be and was content to stay there. The contrast with the woman standing beside him was profound. This Victoria, standing in her 40th floor office, wore armor made of expensive fabric and perfect posture. The Victoria in the photograph wore nothing but herself. Jerome reached for the keyboard to close the image before she noticed. Before this moment became something awkward that they'd both have to pretend hadn't happened. His fingers were an inch from the keys when Victoria's voice cut through the silence. Stop. Jerome's hand froze. He looked up. Victoria was staring at the monitor, at her own image reflected there, at a version of herself she'd probably forgotten existed or had tried to forget. Her expression was unreadable. Not angry, not embarrassed. Something more complex than either emotion allowed. You saw it, not a question, an acknowledgement, a statement of fact that couldn't be denied or deflected. Jerome wanted to lie. Every professional instinct told him to lie, to protect himself. to maintain the careful distance between IT technician and CEO, to pretend his eyes had been elsewhere when the image loaded. But something in Victoria's tone stopped him. Something in the way she was looking at the photograph, like it was evidence of a crime she'd committed against herself. He told the truth instead. Yes, I'm sorry. The system loaded incorrectly. I wasn't trying to... I know you weren't trying. Victoria moved closer to the desk, her eyes still fixed on the image. That was taken 3 years ago. Vermont. I rented a cabin for a week, completely alone. Jerome didn't know what to say. The silence expanded around them, filled with the soft hum of the computer and the distant sound of traffic 40 floors below. Victoria stood motionless, staring at her past self in the photograph. Jerome stood beside her, equally motionless, trapped in a moment he didn't understand and couldn't escape. The clock on the wall showed 10:47, 13 minutes until her investor meeting. But Victoria didn't seem to notice or care. What did you think? The question was so quiet Jerome almost missed it. He looked at her. She was still watching the monitor, still studying the photograph, like it contained answers to questions she'd forgotten to ask. What did you think when you saw it? Jerome felt like the floor had shifted underneath him. This wasn't how conversations with executives were supposed to go. They didn't ask technicians for opinions on personal photographs. They didn't acknowledge 8 technicians as people capable of having opinions. They certainly didn't stand beside them in offices worth more than most people's houses and ask what they thought about private images accidentally revealed during system recoveries. I don't think my opinion matters, Miss Sterling. Victoria turned to look at him directly, the full force of her attention focused on Jerome like a spotlight finding him in darkness. But you have one. Everyone has opinions. They just don't usually say them out loud. Jerome looked at the photograph again, at Victoria Sterling, standing by a lake in Vermont, smiling like she meant it, at a version of someone he'd never met and probably never would meet. He could play it safe, give her the professional answer, tell her it was a nice photograph and leave it at that. Or he could tell her the truth, even though the truth felt dangerous in ways he couldn't articulate. It's a good photograph. The words came slowly, carefully. You look happy in it. Happy. Victoria repeated the word like it was foreign to her, like happiness was a concept she'd learned about in school but never actually experienced. Is that all? There was challenge in her voice. Or maybe a test. Jerome had the distinct feeling that his next words mattered more than they should, that he was standing at a fork in some road he didn't know he'd been traveling. He could take the safe path, tell her she looked professional, successful, powerful, all the things executives wanted to hear about themselves. Or he could take the other path, the one that led somewhere he couldn't see. You look real. Jerome heard himself say the words before he'd fully decided to speak them. Like a person, not a position. The silence that followed felt enormous. It filled the office. It pressed against the windows. It made the air feel thick and hard to breathe. Jerome immediately regretted his honesty. He'd crossed a line, said something too personal, revealed too much of what he actually thought about the difference between the woman in the photograph and the woman standing beside him. He waited for her to tell him to leave, to send a complaint to his supervisor, to remind him that he was here to fix computers, not offer unsolicited psychological observations about her personal photographs. Instead, Victoria turned away from the screen. She looked at Jerome with an expression he couldn't begin to read. Something moved behind her eyes. Something that might have been surprise or recognition or maybe just exhaustion. When she spoke, her voice was different, quieter, more uncertain than he'd heard it all morning. Do you think I'm beautiful? The question landed in the space between them like a physical object. Something solid, something real, something that changed the air pressure in the room. Jerome stared at her, certain he'd misheard, certain his brain had somehow substituted words that made no sense for whatever she'd actually said. But Victoria just stood there waiting for an answer, her expression completely serious. I'm sorry, what? It's a simple question. Victoria's voice remained calm, clinical, like she was asking about quarterly projections or system specifications. In that photograph, do you think I'm beautiful? Jerome's mind raced through every possible response and found none of them adequate. This had to be some kind of test, some elaborate trap designed to catch employees in inappropriate behavior. CEOs didn't ask technicians questions like this. It violated every unwritten rule about professional boundaries and power dynamics. It couldn't be real. Except Victoria was still waiting for an answer, and something in her eyes told him she would know immediately if he lied. Yes. The word came out quiet, barely audible. Jerome forced himself to continue. You're beautiful in that photograph, but not because of anything to do with how you look. Victoria's eyebrows lifted slightly, the first genuine surprise he'd seen from her all morning. Explain that. You look peaceful. Jerome felt the words coming easier now that he'd committed to honesty. Like you're somewhere you actually want to be, doing something you chose to do. That's what makes it a good photograph. Not your face or your clothes or anything else. Just that you look like yourself. The silence stretched out again. Victoria stood very still. So still that Jerome wondered if she was breathing. Her expression had gone completely blank. Unreadable. He couldn't tell if he'd said exactly the right thing or exactly the wrong thing. Couldn't tell if this moment would end with gratitude or termination. And all he could do was stand there and wait for her to decide. Then something shifted in her face. The controlled mask cracked. Just slightly. Just enough. What showed through looked almost like relief, like someone had finally told her something true after years of hearing nothing but carefully calibrated lies. No one has said that to me in a very long time. Her voice was soft, almost vulnerable. That I look like myself. Jerome didn't know how to respond. The clock on the wall showed 10:52, 8 minutes until her investor meeting. But Victoria seemed to have forgotten about meetings and investors and everything else that had made the system recovery urgent 30 minutes ago. She walked to the windows, putting distance between them, between herself and the photograph still displayed on the monitor, between whoever she'd been 3 years ago and whoever she'd become since. Finished the login sequence. When she spoke again, her voice had returned to its usual controlled tone. But something underneath had changed, something he couldn't quite identify. I need access to those files before 11. Yes, ma'am. Jerome turned back to the computer. His hands moved through familiar motions, pulling up the proper login screen, closing the errant window that had displayed the photograph, resetting her session to its correct state. The image of Victoria by the lake disappeared, replaced by the standard corporate login interface. He typed in the administrative override he'd used earlier, verified that all systems were functioning normally, stepped back from the desk. Everything's running now. If you have any other issues, just call the help desk. Thank you, Mr. Washington. Jerome gathered his toolkit. His hands felt clumsy suddenly, like he'd forgotten how to hold things. He moved toward the door, each step feeling heavier than it should. He was almost in the hallway when Victoria's voice stopped him. Jerome. He turned back. She was standing by the windows again, backlit by morning sun streaming through glass that probably cost more per square foot than his monthly rent. The light caught in her hair, made her look almost translucent, almost like the person in the photograph. Thank you for being honest with me, her voice carried across the office. Most people aren't. Jerome nodded. He didn't trust himself to speak. Didn't know what he would say, even if he could. The moment felt too large for words, too significant for the kind of professional pleasantries that usually ended these encounters. So he just nodded and left, closing the door quietly behind him. The hallway stretched out before him, empty and silent. His reflection moved alongside him in the polished marble, a dark figure carrying a toolkit through a space designed for people who didn't carry their own tools. He walked past closed doors and abstract paintings he didn't understand toward the elevator bank that would carry him back down to the third floor. Back to his desk, back to printer jams and password resets, back to invisibility. The elevator arrived empty. Jerome stepped inside and pressed 3. The doors closed. The car descended. He watched the numbers drop on the digital display. 39, 36, 32. Each floor bringing him closer to familiar territory, to safety, to the comfortable anonymity of being just another IT technician in a building full of people who needed their computers fixed. But something had changed. Jerome could feel it in his chest, in the way his hands still felt unsteady holding his toolkit, in the replay of Victoria's voice asking him if she was beautiful, in his own voice answering with something true instead of something safe. The conversation kept looping through his mind, examining itself from different angles, trying to understand what had actually happened in that office. The elevator opened on the third floor. Jerome stepped out into familiar chaos. Someone was standing by the printer, glaring at it like personal offense would make it work. Someone else was on the phone explaining loudly that yes, they'd tried turning it off and on again, and no, it still wasn't working. Normal problems, regular work. The ecosystem he'd learned to navigate through 3 years of careful invisibility. Jerome made it to his desk and set down his toolkit. His phone was blinking with new messages. 3 help tickets had come in during the hour he'd been on the 40th floor. Someone's computer was making a weird noise. Someone else couldn't access their email. Someone had spilled coffee on their keyboard and wanted to know if AT could fix water damage. He pulled up the ticket system and started triaging. The weird noise was probably a dying fan. The email issue was probably a server timeout. The coffee keyboard was probably dead. Standard Tuesday morning problems with standard Tuesday morning solutions. Except Jerome couldn't focus. His mind kept drifting back to the 40th floor, to the photograph of Victoria Sterling standing by a lake, to the question she'd asked him, to his answer that felt both completely honest and potentially catastrophic. He replayed the conversation again, analyzing every word, trying to figure out if he'd done something wrong, if he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, if Monday morning would bring a call from HR and a conversation about appropriate professional boundaries. His phone buzzed. Text from Zoe. Did you think about Brianna? Jerome stared at the message, his brain struggling to shift context. Brianna, right. Zoe's friend who wanted to come over after school. The friend whose mother needed Jerome's permission before allowing her daughter into their apartment. The normal parenting negotiation that happened in the margins between work emergencies and dinner preparation and homework supervision. He typed back after homework. If you finish everything, you can have an hour with Brianna before dinner. 3 dots appeared, then deal. Jerome pocketed his phone and tried to focus on the help tickets. The dying fan belonged to someone named Marcus Chen in accounting. Jerome created a work order for a replacement fan and scheduled it for tomorrow morning. The email issue belonged to Sarah Mitchell in marketing. Jerome walked her through clearing her cache and restarting her session. The coffee keyboard belonged to David Rodriguez in operations. Jerome scheduled a replacement keyboard delivery and added a note about proper beverage management near electronics. Normal work, normal problems, normal solutions. But Jerome's hands kept pausing on the keyboard. His eyes kept losing focus on the screen. His mind kept circling back to Victoria Sterling's office, to the vulnerability in her voice when she asked if anyone thought she looked like herself anymore, to the relief in her expression when he told her the truth. Lunch arrived at noon. Jerome ate at his desk, turkey sandwich from the same deli he visited 4 days a week, chips, a bottle of water that never tasted quite cold enough. Around him, the 3rd floor emptied out as people headed to the cafeteria or the food trucks parked on the street below, or their cars for drives to restaurants that served food better than sandwiches from the same deli. Jerome stayed at his desk. He always stayed at his desk. Eating alone was easier than navigating the social dynamics of lunch groups and finding somewhere to sit where he wouldn't be intruding. His phone rang at 12:30. Unknown number. Jerome almost didn't answer. Unknown numbers were usually spam, warranty extensions for cars he didn't own, urgent messages about credit cards he didn't have. But something made him answer anyway. Maybe curiosity, maybe the strange restlessness that had been building in his chest since he left the 40th floor. Department. This is Jerome, Mr. Washington. A woman's voice. Professional. Efficient. This is Patricia Collins from Executive Administration. Jerome sat up straighter in his chair, his sandwich forgotten, his focus suddenly sharp. Yes, Miss Sterling would like to thank you personally for resolving this morning's system issue. She asked me to ensure you were properly credited for the expedited service. That's not necessary. Jerome kept his voice steady despite the sudden spike in his pulse. I was just doing my job. Nevertheless, Patricia's tone suggested this wasn't a negotiation. Miss Sterling wanted to express her appreciation. She's also requested that any future executive floor IT issues be directed specifically to you if you're available. The words hung in the air. Jerome processed them slowly. Victoria Sterling had specifically requested him. Not just any IT technician. Him, Jerome Washington, the invisible man from the 3rd floor who fixed printer jams and reset passwords. This was either a compliment or a complication, and he couldn't tell which. Of course, I'm happy to help with any technical issues. Excellent. I'll make a note in your file. Patricia paused. For what it's worth, Mr. Washington, Miss Sterling doesn't usually request specific IT personnel. You must have made quite an impression. The call ended before Jerome could respond. He set his phone down and stared at it for a long moment. Made quite an impression. The phrase felt loaded with implications he didn't want to examine. He'd fixed a computer. He'd been honest when asked a direct question. That was all, except it wasn't all. Something else had happened in that office. Something that had nothing to do with corrupted registry files and system recoveries. Jerome finished his sandwich without tasting it. He threw away the wrapper and got back to work. The afternoon proceeded like every other afternoon. Tickets came in, problems got solved. People called the help desk, and Jerome walked them through fixes or scheduled appointments to visit their desks. The third floor hummed along in its familiar rhythm, while Jerome moved through it like he'd been moving through it for 3 years. Invisible, reliable, forgettable. Except he didn't feel invisible anymore. He felt seen. And he wasn't sure whether that was a good thing or something he should be worried about. 3:30 arrived. Jerome left his desk and drove to Oakwood Elementary. He joined the line of cars waiting outside the main entrance, his Honda Accord looking exactly like every other sedan in the pickup line. Parents checking phones, kids streaming out of the building. The daily choreography of elementary school dismissal performing itself for the 1,000th time. Zoe appeared in the doorway, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, her braids swinging as she scanned the car line. She spotted the Honda and started walking toward it, her face breaking into a smile that made everything else fade into background noise. Jerome unlocked the passenger door. Zoe climbed in, dropping her backpack into the footwell with a thud that suggested textbooks weighed more than they did in Jerome's memory of elementary school. "How was your day?" Jerome pulled out of the car line and into traffic. "Good. We started our science project today. Mrs. Patterson said we could pick partners, so Brianna and I are working together. We're going to build a model of the solar system." "That sounds fun. It would be more fun if we could use actual space rocks instead of styrofoam balls. But Mrs. Patterson said that wasn't practical." Zoe pulled her homework folder from her backpack. "I have math worksheets. Can we do them before Brianna comes over?" That was the deal. They stopped at the grocery store on the way home. Jerome let Zoe pick a snack for when Brianna came over. She chose chips and salsa, then negotiated for cookies as well. Jerome agreed to the cookies because he was tired and she'd finished her reading log without being reminded. Small victories in the ongoing battle of single parenthood. Their apartment was on the 4th floor of a building that had been built in the 70s and hadn't been updated much since. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom. Kitchen that opened into a living room that barely fit their couch and television. Rent was $1,200 a month, which was actually reasonable for this part of the city, which was why Jerome had renewed the lease every year, despite the weird stain on the living room ceiling that the landlord kept promising to fix. Zoe dropped her backpack on the couch and spread her homework across the kitchen table. Math worksheets, multiplication problems. 20 questions that all looked identical to Jerome, but apparently represented some crucial skill that 8-year-olds needed to master. He sat beside her while she worked through them, offering hints when she got stuck, reminding her to show her work when she tried to skip steps. She finished at 4:15. Jerome checked her answers. 18 out of 20 correct. The 2 mistakes were simple errors, numbers copied wrong from the problem to the answer line. He pointed them out. Zoe fixed them. Then she looked at him expectantly. "Can Brianna come now?" Jerome pulled out his phone and texted Brianna's mother. "Homework finished. Brianna, welcome until 6. The response came back immediately. "Sending her over now, thank you." Brianna arrived 7 minutes later, knocking on the door with the kind of enthusiasm only 8-year-olds could sustain. Zoe let her in. They disappeared into Zoe's bedroom door, closing behind them, voices immediately rising in animated discussion about something Jerome couldn't quite hear. He sat in the kitchen listening to their muffled conversation, feeling the particular kind of contentment that came from knowing his daughter had a friend who made her laugh. Jerome pulled out his laptop and opened his email. Work messages filled his inbox. Automated notifications about closed help tickets. Replies from people thanking him for fixing their computers. A reminder about the company holiday party in December. Normal email, normal life. Normal everything except for the strange weight that had been sitting in his chest since 10:48 that morning when Victoria Sterling asked him if he thought she was beautiful. He closed his laptop and started making dinner. Spaghetti, easy, fast, something Zoe would actually eat without negotiation. He put water on to boil and opened a jar of sauce. The kitchen filled with the smell of tomato and garlic. In Zoe's room, laughter erupted, high-pitched and genuine, the sound of children finding something hilarious for reasons adults would never understand. Brianna left at 6. Her mother picked her up with profuse thanks and promises to return the favor whenever Jerome needed it. Zoe and Jerome ate dinner at the kitchen table. She told him about her science project in elaborate detail, the planets they'd be making, the order they'd hang them, the fact that Pluto was technically not a planet anymore, but they were including it anyway because it seemed mean not to. Jerome listened and asked questions and tried to focus on his daughter instead of the conversation that kept replaying in his mind. After dinner came homework check, then shower, then teeth, then the bedtime routine that had been the same for 3 years. Zoe climbed into bed with her planets and constellations comforter. Jerome sat on the edge and read from whatever library book she'd chosen that week. Tonight it was something about a girl who discovered she could talk to animals. Zoe's eyes grew heavy halfway through chapter 3. By the end of chapter 4, she was asleep. Jerome turned off the light and stood in her doorway for a moment, watching her breathe. Her braids spread across the pillow, her face peaceful in the glow from her nightlight. 8 years old, growing up faster than he was ready for. Soon she'd be 9, then 10, then a teenager who didn't need him to walk her to school or read her bedtime stories or check her math homework. The thought arrived with his usual mixture of pride and grief. He closed her door and returned to the kitchen. The apartment was quiet, just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic 4 floors below. Jerome sat at the kitchen table with his laptop and a cup of coffee that was more habit than necessity. He opened his email again, refreshed it. Nothing new. He refreshed it again. Still nothing. What was he expecting? An email from Victoria Sterling, thanking him again for fixing her computer? A message from Patricia Collins with further instructions. Some kind of acknowledgement that this morning had been different from every other IT call he'd ever handled. He didn't know, he just knew that something had shifted. Something had changed, and he was waiting to find out whether that change was good or catastrophic. Jerome closed his email and opened a browser instead. He typed Victoria Sterling into the search bar. Thousands of results appeared. Articles about her company, interviews in business magazines, photographs from charity events and board meetings and industry conferences. He clicked through them, studying the images. Victoria in designer suits, Victoria shaking hands with politicians, Victoria accepting awards, Victoria giving speeches. In every photograph, she wore the same controlled expression he'd seen that morning, the same professional mask, nothing like the woman in the photograph by the lake. He kept searching, scrolled through pages of results, found an interview from 6 years ago in Forbes. The journalist had asked Victoria about work-life balance. Her answer had been carefully crafted. Success requires prioritization. I've learned to prioritize effectively. The journalist had pressed, "Do you have regrets?" Victoria's response. "Regret is unproductive. I prefer to focus on future opportunities rather than past decisions." The answer felt hollow now. Jerome thought about Victoria standing in her office that morning, staring at a photograph of herself from 3 years ago, admitting that she couldn't remember the last time anyone had spoken to her like she was a human being. The gap between the public Victoria Sterling and the private woman who asked if anyone thought she looked like herself anymore was vast, maybe unbridgeable. Jerome closed the browser and shut his laptop. It was 9:30. He should go to bed. Tomorrow was Wednesday, another day of printer jams and password resets, another day of moving through the building like he didn't exist. Except now Patricia Collins had made a note in his file. Now Victoria Sterling had specifically requested him for future executive floor IT issues. Now he was visible in ways he'd spent 3 years avoiding. He sat in the kitchen for another hour drinking coffee that had gone cold, staring at nothing in particular, wondering what he'd gotten himself into. Wondering if Tuesday morning had been just another IT call or the beginning of something he didn't know how to name. Wondering if Victoria Sterling was sitting in her penthouse apartment 40 floors above the world, staring at her own nothing, having the same thoughts. Finally, Jerome stood up. He rinsed his coffee cup, turned off the kitchen light, checked that the front door was locked, looked in on Zoe one more time, her small body curled under covers, decorated with planets and stars. Then he went to his own room and lay down in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the building settling around him. Pipes creaking, someone's television through the walls, the distant wail of sirens on the street below. Sleep came slowly. When it finally arrived, Jerome dreamed of lakes and photographs and questions he didn't know how to answer. He dreamed of Victoria Sterling, standing on a dock, asking him over and over if he thought she looked like herself. He dreamed of saying yes, then watching her walk into the water and disappear beneath its surface. He woke at 2:17 with his heart racing, unsure for several seconds where he was or why he felt like he'd lost something important. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator. Jerome lay in the darkness, waiting for his pulse to slow, waiting for the dream to fade. It didn't fade. It sat in his chest like a weight, like a warning, like a promise of something he couldn't identify. He thought about Victoria's voice, asking if he thought she was beautiful. He thought about his own voice, answering with the truth. He thought about the relief in her expression when he told her she looked like herself in that photograph. He thought about all the ways honesty could be dangerous, all the ways visibility could be a trap, all the ways a single conversation could change everything while changing nothing at all. And he thought about Thursday morning when he'd go back to work and resume his invisible life, except he wouldn't be invisible anymore. Patricia Collins had made a note in his file. Victoria Sterling knew his name. The third floor would still be the third floor, but Jerome Washington would be someone different, someone seen, someone who mattered to someone who lived 40 floors above the regular employees. The alarm would ring in 4 hours. Jerome closed his eyes and tried to sleep, tried to silence the questions multiplying in his mind, tried to forget the way Victoria had looked at her own photograph like it was evidence of a person she'd lost along the way to success, tried to forget his own words, "You look like yourself," tried to forget that he told a billionaire CEO the truth when everyone else in her life apparently told her carefully calibrated lies. But he couldn't forget. The memory sat in his chest, stubborn and insistent. And somewhere 40 floors above the world, Jerome imagined Victoria Sterling, lying awake in her own darkness, unable to forget a conversation that should have been nothing but had somehow become something neither of them knew how to name. Wednesday arrived with rain. Jerome dropped Zoe at school under gray skies that threatened worse, watching her run through the entrance with her jacket pulled over her head. The Honda's windshield wipers scraped against glass that never quite cleared. Traffic moved slower than usual, brake lights bleeding red through the downpour. He arrived at Sterling Enterprises 15 minutes late, his shirt damp despite the umbrella he'd forgotten to bring. The third floor was already humming when Jerome reached his desk. His phone showed 6 missed calls, all from the same extension. Patricia Collins, Executive Administration. His stomach tightened. He called back before removing his jacket. "Mr. Washington." Patricia's voice carried its usual efficiency. "Miss Sterling would like to see you this morning. 9:30 in her office. Is there a technical issue?" She didn't specify, just requested your presence. The line went dead. Jerome stared at his phone. 24 hours since their conversation. 24 hours of replaying every word, analyzing every moment, trying to understand what he'd done right or wrong, or somewhere in between. Now he had 45 minutes to figure out whether he was about to be thanked or terminated. He spent those minutes pretending to work, opened help tickets without reading them, typed responses he immediately deleted, checked the clock every 3 minutes. Around him, the third floor continued its Wednesday rhythm. Someone complained about the coffee machine again. Someone else discussed their weekend plans, even though the weekend was still 4 days away. Normal conversations, normal problems, normal life that Jerome no longer felt connected to. 9:25. He gathered his toolkit from habit, then realized he probably wouldn't need it. This wasn't a technical call. This was something else. He left the toolkit under his desk and walked to the elevator empty-handed. The car arrived full of people heading down, their bodies pressing against his briefly before the doors closed and carried him upward alone. The 40th floor reception area looked different in the rain. The windows that had sparkled with Tuesday sunlight now showed a city rendered in shades of gray. The receptionist glanced up, recognition immediate this time. She gestured toward the hallway without checking his badge. "Miss Sterling is expecting you." Same office. Jerome walked the marble corridor for the second time in 2 days. His reflection kept pace alongside him, darker against the storm-dimmed windows. Victoria's door stood open. She sat behind her desk, focused on her laptop, fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced speed. She wore navy today. Her hair pulled back in the same effortless style that probably required an hour in a professional. She didn't look up when Jerome knocked. Close the door. Sit down. Jerome obeyed both instructions. The click of the door closing felt final. He chose the same chair he'd sat in yesterday, hands resting on his knees, waiting. Victoria continued typing for another 30 seconds. Then she stopped, closed the laptop, and looked at him directly. The full force of her attention landed like physical weight. I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to answer honestly. Okay, yesterday when you saw that photograph and I asked your opinion, why did you tell me the truth? Of all the questions Jerome had prepared for, that wasn't one. He considered his answer carefully. Because you asked, and you seemed like you actually wanted to know. Most people, when asked a question by their CEO, tell her what they think she wants to hear. Victoria leaned back slightly in her chair. You didn't do that? Why not? Because you can probably tell when people are lying to you. Jerome met her gaze directly. And because I figured if you asked the question, you already knew the answer you were supposed to get. Maybe you wanted to hear something different. Something flickered in Victoria's expression. She stood and moved to the windows, her back to Jerome, her reflection visible in the rain-streaked glass. Do you know why I started this company, Mr. Washington? No, ma'am, because I wanted to build something that mattered, something real. She looked down at her hands. I was 24. I had an idea and no money, and everyone told me it was impossible. So I made it possible. Jerome didn't interrupt. The silence felt deliberate, like Victoria was building towards something she needed him to understand. 20 years later, I have everything I was supposed to want. Success, wealth, influence. I sit in rooms with people who control billions of dollars, and they listen when I talk. Victoria turned from the window to face him. And I can't remember the last time anyone spoke to me like I was a human being instead of a balance sheet. The honesty in her voice caught Jerome off guard. This wasn't the controlled CEO from yesterday's phone call about Tokyo projections. This was something raw, more vulnerable. Yesterday you saw a photograph of me from 3 years ago. That lake in Vermont. I rented that cabin for a week, completely alone. No phone calls, no meetings, no one needing me to make decisions or approve budgets or fix their problems. Her eyes found his. It was the last time I felt like myself. Jerome wanted to say something but couldn't find words adequate to the moment. Victoria continued, when you told me I looked real like a person and not a position, I realized you'd identified exactly what I'd lost. She returned to her desk, pulled a folder from a drawer, set it between them. I couldn't stop thinking about it all day. I kept replaying our conversation, analyzing it, trying to figure out if you had an angle, some ulterior motive for being honest. I don't. Jerome kept his voice quiet. I fix computers. That's my angle. The corner of Victoria's mouth lifted slightly, almost a smile. I know. I had my assistant pull your employment file. 3 years at Sterling Enterprises. Consistently good performance reviews. Single father, 1 daughter. You live in Oakwood, drive a Honda Accord, and have never asked for a promotion beyond standard annual increases. The fact that she'd investigated him should have felt invasive. Instead, it felt like confirmation that Tuesday had affected her the same way it had affected him. You're invisible. Victoria's observation carried no cruelty, just fact. You do your job well, but nobody notices you. You move through this building like you don't exist. That's accurate. Why? Because I have a daughter who needs stability more than I need recognition. Jerome's answer came without hesitation. Because keeping my head down and doing good work means I keep my job, and Zoe keeps her health care, and we keep our apartment. That's enough. Victoria studied him for a long moment. Then she pushed the folder across the desk. I'm launching a new internal project. Very small team, very confidential, focused on restructuring our approach to employee wellness and company culture. I need people on this team who will tell me the truth, not what they think I want to hear. Jerome looked at the folder but didn't touch it. I'd like you to join the team. The words didn't make sense at first. Jerome replayed them, trying to understand what she was actually saying. I'm an IT technician. I don't know anything about employee wellness or company culture. No, but you know what it's like to be invisible in this building. You know what the regular employees experience every day because you're one of them. Victoria leaned forward. And you're honest. That's what I need more than expertise. Why me, Jerome asked. There are thousands of employees here. Why would you pick someone you just met yesterday? Because yesterday you looked at me and saw a person. Victoria's voice was simple, direct. Everyone else in this building sees a position, a title, a source of approval, or fear or opportunity. But you saw someone who looked peaceful in a photograph by a lake. That's the perspective I need. Jerome looked at the folder again, thought about Zoe, about stability, about the risk of stepping outside his invisible role. He also thought about Victoria's question from yesterday. Do you think I'm beautiful in the way she looked when he gave her an honest answer? What would this involve? Meetings? 2 or 3 times a week, mostly evenings. You'd keep your regular position, but this would be additional work. The team is small, 5 people including yourself. Confidential. We're trying to identify systemic problems in how this company treats its employees and find real solutions. Would there be additional compensation? 15% increase to your base salary, plus a project completion bonus. 15%. That was Zoe's college fund becoming real instead of theoretical. But money wasn't the only consideration. Jerome thought about what it would mean to step into visibility, to be associated with a project run directly by Victoria Sterling. It would change everything. Can I think about it? Of course, Victoria pushed the folder toward him. Take this, read the project overview. Let me know by Friday. Jerome picked up the folder. It felt heavier than it should. I'm not trying to pull you out of your comfortable position as some kind of social experiment. Victoria's tone gentled. I'm asking because I think you have something valuable to offer. Because I need people around me who aren't afraid to tell me when I'm wrong. Jerome stood the folder tucked under his arm. He should say something professional. Instead, he said, you should go back to that lake sometime. The one in Vermont. Victoria looked surprised. You looked happy there. Jerome continued, like yourself. Maybe you need that more than another successful project. He left before she could respond. The elevator ride down felt different. The folder weighed heavy under his arm. Jerome's mind spun with possibilities and consequences, risks and opportunities. He'd expected to be fired. Instead, he'd been offered something he couldn't categorize. A chance, a complication, a risk. When he reached his desk, he shoved the folder into his bag and tried to focus on help tickets. But his mind kept drifting to Victoria's office, to the conversation, to the way she'd looked when he told her to go back to the lake. Jerome spent 3 days with the folder. He'd pull it out after Zoe went to bed, spread the papers across the kitchen table, trying to imagine himself in those meetings, sitting with executives and department heads, offering opinions about company culture like he had authority to do so. The rational part of his brain listed reasons to decline. He wasn't qualified, he'd be out of his depth. The visibility would make him uncomfortable. What if he failed and lost not just the project but his regular job too? But there was another voice, quieter but persistent. You saw a person. That's the perspective I need. Thursday evening, Zoe asked why he kept staring at papers instead of watching their movie. Jerome told her it was work stuff. She accepted that answer but kept glancing at him with the perceptive look she got when she knew he wasn't telling her everything. Friday morning, Jerome made his decision. At 8:30, before he could change his mind, he called Patricia Collins, Executive Administration. Patricia speaking. This is Jerome Washington. I need to speak with Miss Sterling about the project proposal. One moment. Hold music filled his ear. Classical something with violins. Jerome waited, his free hand drumming against his desk. Then Victoria's voice came through, clear and professional. Mr. Washington, have you made a decision? Yes, ma'am. I'd like to accept the position on the team. Brief silence. When Victoria spoke again, something in her tone had shifted, become less formal. I'm glad. The first meeting is Monday evening at 6. Can you arrange childcare? Jerome thought about Mrs. Henderson. I can make it work. Good. Patricia will send you the details. And Mr. Washington? Yes. Thank you for taking the risk. She ended the call before he could respond. Jerome sat at his desk, staring at his phone, wondering what exactly he'd just agreed to. Monday evening arrived faster than expected. Jerome dropped Zoe at Mrs. Henderson's apartment at 5:30 with her homework and a promise to be back by 8. Mrs. Henderson waved him off with a knowing smile. Big meeting, something like that. The 40th floor was quieter at this hour. Most regular employees already gone. Jerome found the conference room at the end of the hall. Through the glass walls, he saw three people already seated. He recognized Raymond Foster from legal. The other two were strangers. Jerome pushed open the door. All three looked up. Raymond stood and extended his hand. Mid-40s, salt and pepper hair, confident posture that came from years of courtroom experience. You must be Jerome Washington. Raymond Foster, legal. They shook hands. Raymond gestured to the others. This is Lisa Thompson from Human Resources and Michael Barnes from Operations. Jerome shook hands with both, noting the curiosity in their expressions. They were probably wondering why an IT technician was on this team. He was wondering the same thing. Take a seat. Raymond gestured to an empty chair. Miss Sterling should be here shortly. Jerome sat down, acutely aware of the difference between his department store button-down and everyone else's designer labels. Also aware that he was the only black person in the room. Familiar feeling, familiar navigation. The door opened. Victoria walked in. Everyone stood automatically. She waved them down with an efficient gesture and took her seat at the head of the table. Gray suit today, hair pulled back, expression all business. Thank you all for agreeing to be part of this project. She began without preamble. This team was selected because each of you brings a perspective I need. Raymond, you understand legal frameworks. Lisa, you have direct insight into employee concerns. Michael, you know operational realities of implementing change at scale. She turned to Jerome directly. And Mr. Washington is here because he understands what it's like to be invisible in this company. The bluntness made everyone turn to look at him. Jerome felt his face getting warm, but kept his expression neutral. The goal is simple, Victoria continued. I want to identify why talented people leave this company, why morale is declining despite competitive salaries. What we can do to fix it, but I don't want surface-level solutions. I want to understand the real problems. She opened a folder. Over the next 3 months, we'll conduct confidential interviews with employees at every level, gather data, analyze patterns, develop actionable recommendations for structural changes. She looked around the table. This is confidential work. Nothing discussed in this room leaves this room. Understood. Everyone nodded. The meeting lasted 2 hours. They discussed methodology, timelines, interview protocols. Jerome mostly listened, occasionally taking notes, trying to absorb the scope of what they were attempting. Lisa talked about exit interview data showing concerning patterns. Michael mentioned operational bottlenecks frustrating mid-level managers. Raymond outlined potential legal considerations. When Victoria asked for Jerome's input, he almost deflected, almost said he didn't have anything to add, but then he remembered why she'd asked him to be here. Most of the people I work with don't think anyone at this level cares what they think, he said. They assume complaints go into a black hole, so they stop complaining and just accept things the way they are. The room went quiet. Lisa looked uncomfortable. Michael frowned. Victoria leaned forward slightly. Explain that. 6 months ago, someone on my floor submitted a suggestion about the parking garage lighting. It's too dim in certain sections, especially in winter when people leave after dark. The suggestion went to facilities management. Nothing happened. The person never heard back, never got an explanation. Now, when people ask him if they should bother making suggestions, he tells them not to waste their time. That's a facilities issue, Michael said. Not really what we're addressing here. It's exactly what we're addressing. Victoria's tone was sharp. That kind of dismissal is why people stop engaging, why they stop believing the company cares about anything except productivity. She made a note, then looked back at Jerome. What else? Over the next hour, Jerome found himself talking more than expected. About small indignities regular employees dealt with every day. The way executive assistants treated anyone below a certain pay grade, like they were interrupting something important. The fact that the third-floor break room had waited 4 months for a working microwave while the executive floor had full catering service. Some of it felt petty as he said it out loud, but Victoria didn't dismiss any of it. She took notes, asked follow-up questions, pushed him to be specific. When the meeting ended at 8:15, Jerome felt exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. It was the exhaustion of being seen, of being taken seriously, of mattering in a way he hadn't mattered in years. Everyone filed out except Victoria, still making notes. Jerome gathered his things slowly, unsure whether to leave or wait. You did well tonight, Victoria said without looking up. I mostly just complained about parking garage lighting. You identified a systemic problem with how this company handles employee feedback. That's valuable. She finished writing and looked up at him. How did it feel? The question was more personal than professional. Jerome considered deflecting, but that wasn't why he was here. Uncomfortable, he admitted, like I was betraying everyone on the third floor by sitting at this table. But you stayed. I stayed. Victoria stood gathering her materials. The discomfort means you're doing something real. The moment you get comfortable in these meetings is the moment you stop being useful to me. They walked toward the door together. The 40th floor was completely empty now, just dim lighting and the distant hum of building systems. How's your daughter? Victoria asked as they walked toward the elevators. The question surprised him. She's good, worried about her friend moving to California, but otherwise good. That's hard at that age. Losing friends. Yeah, but she's resilient. Takes after her grandmother that way. They reached the elevator bank. Victoria pressed the call button. I meant what I said in my note, she said, looking straight ahead. About you seeing me. I haven't felt seen in a very long time. Jerome didn't know what to say. The elevator arrived. They stepped inside together. Victoria pressed the button for the ground floor. They rode down in silence. When the doors opened on the third floor, Jerome stepped out. He turned back to say goodnight and found Victoria watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Same time next Monday. I'll be here. The doors closed and she was gone. The weeks folded into each other like pages in a book Jerome had stopped trying to close. Monday and Thursday evenings became their own rhythm. 6 o'clock sharp. Conference room at the end of the 40th floor hallway. 5 people around a table trying to diagnose why a billion-dollar company was hemorrhaging talent despite competitive salaries and comprehensive benefits packages. The third meeting, Lisa shared turnover data that shocked everyone. Engineering department alone had lost 18 people in 6 months, all of them hired by competitors offering less money. When Raymond asked why Lisa pulled up exit interview transcripts, the phrases repeated like a mantra nobody wanted to hear. Felt undervalued, no growth opportunities, leadership doesn't listen, work-life balance non-existent. Michael proposed structural changes that Raymond immediately flagged as legally problematic. Union considerations, existing contracts. The architecture of a corporation built over 20 years couldn't be redesigned overnight just because good people kept walking out the door. But Victoria listened to every objection, made notes in her precise handwriting, then asked Jerome what he thought. Jerome had been quiet for most of the meeting, listening, learning the language these people spoke, the way they turned human problems into data points and data points into strategic initiatives. But when Victoria asked directly, he couldn't hide behind silence anymore. The people leaving aren't looking for structural changes. They're looking for someone to notice they exist. His words landed in the conference room like stones in still water. They want to feel like their work matters beyond quarterly earnings reports, like they're building something real instead of just hitting targets. Lisa wrote that down. Michael frowned but didn't argue. Raymond asked Jerome to elaborate. Victoria just watched him with that focused intensity he'd started recognizing. The look that said she was cataloging everything he said for later analysis. By the 5th meeting, Jerome had stopped feeling like an imposter. His perspective mattered. Not despite his position, but because of it. When they discussed implementing an anonymous feedback system, Jerome's concerns about employees fearing retaliation shaped the entire initiative. When Michael suggested mandatory team-building exercises, Jerome explained why forced fun made people resent leadership more than no fun at all. When Lisa proposed exit interview reform, Jerome pointed out that people leaving didn't trust the process enough, to be honest. The 7th meeting ran long, 9:15 when Victoria finally closed her laptop. Everyone else had left 20 minutes earlier. Jerome had stayed to finish his notes documenting the decisions they'd reached about pilot programs for 3 departments. He looked up to find Victoria watching him from across the table. You don't have to stay late just because I do. I'm not staying because you are. Jerome closed his notebook. I'm staying because I want to finish while it's fresh in my mind. Victoria smiled, small, genuine. The first real smile he'd seen from her since that photograph by the lake. How's Zoe handling your schedule? She's adapted. Jerome packed his things into his bag. Mrs. Henderson has been helpful. Zoe likes her, Says she makes better cookies than I do. Does she significantly better? I burn everything that requires an oven. Victoria laughed, an actual laugh, not the polite professional sound she made in board meetings, something surprised and human. I'm the same way. I once set off the fire alarm in my apartment trying to make toast. They walked to the elevator together, a habit now, but 7 meetings and it had become routine for Victoria to walk Jerome to the elevator bank, both of them unwinding from the intensity of the work they were doing. The conversations in that hallway had started professional. Gradually, they'd shifted into something else, something neither of them had named yet. Do you ever feel like you're betraying your daughter? Victoria asked as they waited for the elevator. By choosing work over time with her, the question was more personal than anything she'd asked before. Jerome considered deflecting. But deflection wasn't what they did anymore, every day. But I also know she needs stability more than she needs me at every school event. Finding that balance is impossible. You just keep adjusting and hoping you're getting more right than wrong. The elevator arrived. They stepped inside. Victoria pressed the button for the ground floor for the third floor. Neither of them spoke during the descent, but the silence felt comfortable, like two people who'd learned they could exist in the same space without filling every second with words. When the doors opened on 3, Jerome stepped out, turned back. Victoria was watching him with an expression he still couldn't fully read, something softer than the CEO mask, something more uncertain than her usual controlled confidence. Same time Thursday. I'll be here. The doors closed. Jerome stood in the empty third-floor hallway listening to the elevator descend, carrying the Victoria back down to the ground floor in whatever penthouse apartment she went home to every night. He wondered if she ate dinner alone, if she sat in silence the way he did after Zoe went to bed, if she felt the particular kind of loneliness that came from being surrounded by people who wanted things from you but never knew who you actually were. Week 6 brought the first real conflict. Michael presented a proposal to mandate mental health days, paid time off specifically designated for employee well-being. On paper, it looked progressive. In practice, Jerome could see the problems immediately. People won't use them. He spoke before he'd fully decided to. The words just came out. They'll be afraid it'll mark them as weak, that management will see them as less committed, that it'll affect their performance reviews. Michael bristled. We'd make it clear there would be no negative consequences. Except you can't make that clear enough. Jerome leaned forward. Because the culture here punishes vulnerability. People come to work sick because they don't want to seem unreliable. You think they're going to voluntarily flag themselves as having mental health struggles. That's exactly why we need this policy. Lisa jumped in. To change that culture. Policies don't change culture. Jerome's voice was firm, but not aggressive. People change culture. And people here have learned that showing weakness gets you passed over for promotions or quietly moved to less critical projects. A policy won't fix that overnight. The room went quiet. Raymond was taking notes. Lisa looked uncomfortable. Michael looked angry. Victoria was watching Jerome with that same focused intensity. What would you suggest instead? Victoria asked. Start smaller. Jerome had been thinking about this for weeks. Start with leadership modeling the behavior. If executives take mental health days and talk about it openly, that signals it's acceptable. If it stays theoretical, if it's just a policy in the handbook that nobody important actually uses, then it's worthless. Victoria made a note. Then she looked around the table. We'll table mandatory mental health days for now. Instead, we'll develop a leadership initiative. I'll take the first one myself, make it visible, make it normal. Michael opened his mouth to argue. Victoria's expression stopped him. The meeting continued, but something had shifted. Jerome had challenged a senior vice president's proposal, and Victoria had sided with him. That would have consequences. He just didn't know what kind yet. After the meeting, Victoria asked Jerome to stay behind. His stomach tightened. Here it comes. The conversation about knowing his place, about not overstepping, about remembering he was there to provide perspective, not make decisions. Instead, Victoria said, "Thank you." For what? For being right. Michael's proposal would have failed spectacularly. It would have cost money and goodwill and accomplished nothing. You saved us from that mistake. I thought I might have overstepped. You did. Victoria's smile was wry. But that's what I need you to do. Everyone else in those meetings is too polite or too political to tell me when something won't work. You just say it. They walked to the elevator. The 40th floor was empty again. Just them and the distant hum of building systems and the city lights visible through the windows. Victoria pressed the call button but didn't say anything. Jerome waited. He'd learned that sometimes she needed silence to organize her thoughts. I'm going back to Vermont next month. Victoria spoke to the elevator doors, not to Jerome. The cabin by the lake. 4 days. No phone, no meetings, no one needing anything from me. That's good. Jerome meant it. You should do that. I wanted you to know why I'll miss our Thursday meeting. The elevator arrived. They both looked at it. Neither moved to get in. Thank you for this. Victoria's voice was quieter now, almost vulnerable. For taking the risk. For being honest. For not treating me like a position. Thank you for seeing me, Jerome replied, for making me visible. She smiled then, a real smile, the one from the photograph by the lake. Then she stepped into the elevator and the doors closed and Jerome was alone in the empty hallway. He stood there for a moment, understanding that something had shifted between them over these past weeks. Something that went beyond professional collaboration or mutual respect. Something that felt like the beginning of friendship. Or maybe something more complicated than friendship. Something neither of them had expected to find. Jerome took the stairs down to the 3rd floor, picked up his things, drove home to Zoe, made dinner, helped with homework, did all the normal things that made up his normal life. But he didn't feel invisible anymore. And somewhere 40 floors above him, he thought maybe Victoria didn't feel quite so alone. Week 8 arrived with autumn beginning its slow turn toward winter. The trees visible from the 40th floor windows were starting to change color. Gold and orange and red bleeding into green. The meetings continued. Data accumulated. Patterns emerged. They identified 12 major issues affecting employee retention. Developed pilots for 7 potential solutions. Raymond was drafting policy language. Lisa was preparing focus groups. Michael had grudgingly accepted that cultural change required more than mandates. The Thursday meeting in week 8 ended early. They'd covered everything on the agenda by 7:30. Everyone packed up efficiently, eager to reclaim their evening. Raymond left first, then Lisa, then Michael. Jerome was gathering his notebook when Victoria spoke. Walk with me. It wasn't a question. Jerome followed her out of the conference room, but instead of heading toward the elevators, Victoria turned the opposite direction, toward the northern wing, toward her office. She opened the door and gestured for him to enter. He did. She closed the door behind them. The office looked the same as it had 8 weeks ago. Same massive desk, same 3 monitors, same floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over a city that never stopped moving. Victoria walked to those windows and stood there, arms crossed, looking out at the lights beginning to appear as darkness fell. I leave for Vermont on Friday, she said. 4 days. I keep thinking about what you said. About how I looked like myself in that photograph. About how I looked peaceful. Jerome didn't interrupt. He could hear something building in her voice. Something she needed to say and didn't quite know how. I haven't felt peaceful in so long, I can barely remember what it feels like. Victoria continued. I wake up at 5 every morning already thinking about problems that need solving. I go to bed at midnight with my mind still racing through scenarios and contingencies. I move through every day surrounded by people and I'm completely alone. She turned from the window to face him. You changed that just by being honest with me. Just by seeing me as a person instead of a position. These past 8 weeks coming to these meetings, talking with you afterward, it's been the only time I've felt like myself. Jerome's chest tightened. He didn't know what to say. Didn't know if there was anything to say that wouldn't change everything between them. I'm not asking you for anything. Victoria's voice was steady, but her eyes held something desperate. I just needed you to know that you've given me something I didn't know I was missing. Connection, authenticity, someone who isn't afraid to tell me the truth. You've given me the same thing. Jerome's words came without planning. I've been invisible for 3 years. You made me visible. You made me matter. That changed my life. They stood in the silence that followed. The city lights glittered beyond the windows. 40 floors below, people were leaving work, heading home, living their lives in the space between one day and the next. Up here, Jerome and Victoria existed in their own separate reality. Two people who'd found something neither of them had been looking for. Victoria broke the silence first. I should let you go home to Zoe. Yeah, Jerome didn't move. Will you be at the Monday meeting when I get back if you want me there? I want you there. Then I'll be there. They walked to the elevator together one last time before Vermont. The hallway stretched out before them empty and quiet. Their footsteps echoed against marble. At the elevator bank, Victoria pressed the call button. They waited. The silence between them felt weighted with things unsaid. Things maybe better left unsaid. The elevator arrived. Jerome stepped inside, turned to face her. Victoria stood in the hallway, backlit by the office lights behind her. She looked smaller somehow, more human, less like a CEO and more like someone who was about to spend 4 days alone in a cabin trying to remember who she used to be. Enjoy Vermont, Jerome said. I will. Victoria's voice was soft. Thank you, Jerome. For everything. The doors closed before he could respond. The elevator descended, carrying Jerome away from the 40th floor, away from Victoria Sterling, back to his life. But his life didn't feel the same anymore. Something had changed, something fundamental. He wasn't sure what it meant, wasn't sure where it led. Just knew that he'd been part of something important in that office, something that mattered beyond project outcomes and employee retention statistics. When Jerome got home, Zoe was already asleep. Mrs. Henderson reported a good evening. Homework finished, dinner eaten, bath taken, the routine of childhood performing itself with comforting predictability. Jerome paid Mrs. Henderson, thanked her, locked the door behind her. Then he sat in his kitchen with cold coffee and his laptop, staring at nothing in particular. His phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number. He opened it, made it home safe. Thank you for tonight, for listening, for understanding. V.S. Jerome stared at the message. Victoria Sterling had his personal number now, had texted him from her personal phone. This was crossing some line they'd been careful not to cross before. This was making their relationship personal instead of professional. This was dangerous in ways Jerome couldn't fully articulate. He typed back, Vermont will be good for you. Come back ready to keep fighting for real change here. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then I will. Good night, Jerome. Good night, Victoria. Jerome set his phone down, sat in the silence of his kitchen. Wondered what would happen when Victoria came back from Vermont. Wondered if the 4 days alone would change her perspective. Wondered if the distance would make her realize that this connection they'd built was inappropriate or unsustainable, or just a temporary aberration in her otherwise controlled life. But mostly he wondered if she'd come back looking more like the person in that photograph by the lake, more peaceful, more herself, more ready to be the leader this company needed instead of just the CEO it had. Friday came. Jerome worked through his help tickets with half his attention. The other half kept drifting to thoughts of Vermont, of Victoria sitting alone in a cabin by a lake, of whether she'd find what she was looking for there, of whether 4 days would be enough to remember who she used to be before success required sacrificing everything else. Monday arrived. Jerome went to work expecting normalcy. Instead, he found an email from Patricia Collins. Miss Sterling has extended her Vermont trip through Wednesday. The Monday meeting is canceled. We'll resume our regular schedule next week. Jerome read the message 3 times. Victoria had extended her trip. That was good. That meant she was finding whatever she needed there. That meant the cabin by the lake was giving her what the 40th floor never could. Peace, space, room to breathe and remember what it felt like to be herself. Wednesday evening, his phone buzzed. Another text from Victoria's number. Back tomorrow. Thank you for pushing me to do this. It was exactly what I needed. See you Thursday at 6. Jerome smiled. Type back. Glad to hear it. See you Thursday. Thursday arrived. Jerome finished his regular work early, left the 3rd floor at 5:30, stopped by Mrs. Henderson's to drop off Zoe, took the elevator to 40 at 5:55. The conference room was already occupied. Raymond and Lisa talking quietly. Michael reviewing something on his tablet. Jerome took his usual seat. Victoria arrived at 6 exactly. She walked into the conference room and Jerome's breath caught. She looked different, lighter somehow. Her hair was still pulled back but less severely. Her suit was the same professional armor she always wore, but she moved in it differently. Less rigid, more relaxed, and her eyes. Her eyes held something they hadn't held before. Peace, the kind of peace that came from 4 days of silence and solitude and remembering who you were underneath all the weight you carried. She smiled at the room, at everyone. But her eyes found Jerome and held there for just a moment. Thank you all for your patience with my extended absence. Vermont was necessary and productive. I'm ready to move forward with our initiatives. The meeting proceeded. They discussed focus group results, reviewed pilot program data, made decisions about next steps. Victoria was engaged but different. She listened more, spoke less, let other people finish their thoughts instead of jumping ahead to conclusions. Something had shifted in her, something fundamental. When the meeting ended at 8, everyone left quickly. Everyone except Jerome. He stayed behind, packing his things slowly. Victoria was making notes at the head of the table. She looked up when everyone else was gone. Walk with me. Jerome followed her to the elevator. They stood side by side, waiting for the car to arrive. The silence felt comfortable, familiar, like two people who'd learned they didn't need words to understand each other. Vermont was good, Victoria said finally. Really good. I remembered what it feels like to be just Victoria instead of Victoria Sterling, CEO. I remembered what peace feels like. I can see it. Jerome meant it. You look different. I feel different. She turned to look at him directly. You were right. I needed that more than another successful project. I needed to remember who I am underneath all of this. The elevator arrived. They stepped inside. Victoria pressed 3. The doors closed. The car began its descent. I've been thinking, Victoria spoke to the closing doors, about what happens after this project ends. About whether I can maintain this feeling or if it'll disappear the moment real work starts again. You'll maintain it, Jerome's voice was certain, because you know what it feels like now. You have something to protect. The elevator reached 3. The doors opened. Jerome stepped out, turned back. Victoria was watching him with an expression he'd seen before. In her office 8 weeks ago, when she'd asked if he thought she was beautiful, vulnerable, open, real. Thank you for seeing me, Jerome. For making me visible even when I was trying to hide. Thank you for seeing me too. For making me matter when I'd convinced myself invisibility was enough. The doors began to close. At the last second, Victoria reached out and stopped them. One more thing. Her voice was quiet. Careful. I don't know what this is, this thing between us, but I know it matters. I know it's real, and I know I don't want to lose it. Neither do I. The doors closed. The elevator descended, carrying Victoria away. Jerome stood alone in the third-floor hallway, his heart beating faster than it should. Something had shifted between them. Something neither of them had named yet. Something that felt like the beginning of everything or the end of nothing, or maybe just the truth they'd both been avoiding. He walked to his desk, gathered his things, drove to Mrs. Henderson's to pick up Zoe, carried her sleeping form to their apartment, tucked her into bed with her planets and constellations comforter, stood in her doorway watching her breathe. His phone buzzed. He pulled it out. Message from Victoria, good night, Jerome. Thank you for everything. He typed back, good night, Victoria, welcome back. Jerome went to his own room, lay down in the darkness, thought about Victoria Sterling asking him what this thing between them was, thought about his own answer. Neither do I want to lose it. Thought about what that meant, what it could mean, what it would mean. He didn't have answers. But for the first time in 3 years, he didn't need them. For the first time in 3 years, he wasn't invisible, wasn't alone, wasn't just moving through each day waiting for it to end so he could start another one exactly like it. Victoria Sterling had seen him, really seen him, and he'd seen her. Not the CEO, not the position, just the person underneath. The woman in the photograph by the lake who'd forgotten what it felt like to be herself. They'd found each other in the space between their very different worlds, found connection, found authenticity, found something neither of them had been looking for, but both of them desperately needed. The story didn't end with declarations, didn't end with certainty, ended with understanding. With two people who'd been invisible and alone finding each other, finding themselves, finding that maybe peace wasn't about having everything figured out. Maybe peace was just about being seen. And that was enough.